In just 37 seconds, one man said more truth than most shows allow in an entire season. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. They say silence is power. But on a cold Tuesday morning in Manhattan, Denzel Washington sat in front of a camera and broke it. No lights, no makeup, no studio audience, just a single lens, a neutral gray wall, and the man America had admired for decades, dressed in a plain navy sweater and speaking in a voice so steady it felt like it had already been echoing in your head. "I turned down this show for 15 years, he said, eyes level with the lens. "I said yes today because I've had enough." There was no dramatic music, no countdown, just that. Hours earlier, before the cameras rolled, before Twitter broke, and before The View lost control of its own stage, Denzel walked into the building alone. No assistant, no PR handler, just a well-worn leather briefcase that had seen more press rooms and prayer circles than Hollywood parties. Producers weren't sure what to make of him. Most celebrity guests came with managers, media prep, a checklist of talking points. Denzel, he nodded at the security guard, shook hands with the stage tech, and when offered a rundown of the segment schedule, he raised an eyebrow and smiled. Not a warm smile, more like one that asked if you were serious. "I didn't come here for questions," he said calmly. "I came for answers." He was early. The green room was quiet. A junior staffer offered tea. He declined. Instead, he sat down, opened the briefcase, and pulled out an old notebook. The cover was cracked at the corners, the spine weathered. He flipped through a few pages slowly, not reading, remembering. Behind the wall, the theme music of The View began to play. The canned applause, the over-rehearsed banter. Joy Behar made a joke. Whoopi Goldberg laughed. Sonny chimed in with a quote. Same rhythm, different day. Denzel didn't look up. 5 minutes. Someone called from the hallway. He closed the notebook, set it beside him, and stood. No mirror check, no mic adjustment. He just took a breath, deep, centered, like he was preparing for something heavier than an interview. Because he was. Inside the control room, one producer whispered, "You think he'll stay on script?" Another replied, "You ever seen Denzel take a script he didn't believe in?" Back on stage, the air was lighter than it should have been. They were planning to talk about unity, about division in the country, about finding common ground through honest conversation. But everyone knew those words meant different things to different people. And the truth, they didn't invite Denzel to play guest. They invited him to be a moment. He walked out without fanfare. No wave, no grin, just presence, quiet, anchored, unshakable. He wore a dark suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, a look that said, "I came to be clear, not comfortable." The audience clapped, unsure if they were cheering for the man or the myth. The hosts greeted him, one by one. Whoopi leaned in first. "Thank you for being here, Mr. Washington." He met her eyes and said simply, "Thank you for having me." That was it. No small talk, no easing in, just that. And yet something in the room shifted. The applause faded faster than usual. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was alert. Like everyone sensed this wasn't going to be daytime TV as usual, because it wasn't. This wasn't Denzel the actor. This wasn't the man from the movies, the red carpets, the commencement speeches. This was Denzel Washington, son of a Pentecostal preacher, father of 4, a man who had spent decades watching the world try to dress lies up like dialogue. And now, finally, he had said yes, not to the performance, but to the pause, and he wasn't planning to waste it. The conversation started with a question so soft, it almost floated past the tension in the air. "So," Whoopi began, her voice steady but searching, "we've been talking all week about truth, division, and how we start bridging those gaps. What does that look like to you?" Denzel looked around the table before answering. Joy, arms crossed. Sonny, already leaning forward. Alyssa, fingers dancing nervously against a notepad. The studio lights cast no shadows today. Every expression was laid bare. He didn't answer right away. He folded his hands, rested them on the table, and took a single breath through his nose. Then, quietly, he said, "Maybe it starts by asking if we actually want the truth, or just something that sounds good over coffee." You could almost hear the shift, one of those invisible moments when everyone in the room realizes the conversation just veered off the path they'd prepared for. Alyssa gave a small laugh, trying to smooth the moment. "Well, that's definitely one way to stir the pot." Denzel turned slightly toward her, eyes steady. "Stirring the pot's not the problem," he replied. "Lying about what's in it is." Joy's smile faltered. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "With respect," she said, "this is a show. We try to take complex things and make them understandable. That's our job. Denzel nodded once. Understandable, sure. But at what cost? There was a silence, sharper now, edged with something that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Uncertainty, challenge, maybe even fear. He continued, voice calm, never rising. I've watched this country pick headlines like outfits. One week it's outrage, the next week it's amnesia. And somewhere in between, people forget that there are stories that never got told. Are you saying, Joy interrupted, that we're part of the problem? I'm saying, Denzel said, that comfort has a rhythm, and some of us weren't born into it. We notice when the beat changes. Sonny blinked. Alyssa looked down at her notes. Whoopi was no longer smiling. The studio audience had gone quiet. Not polite quiet, still quiet. A quiet that came not from boredom, but from something else. Anticipation. The feeling you get just before a storm breaks. Whoopi cleared her throat. Mr. Washington, you've had a long career. You've worked with media your whole life. Surely you know there's pressure. We're trying to reach people, keep things accessible. Denzel tilted his head slightly. Accessibility without honesty is just manipulation with good lighting. He wasn't angry. That's what made it land. His tone never shifted. His hands never moved. But every word was placed like a stone. Precise, heavy, intentional. Let me ask you something, he said, leaning forward just a little. How many segments have been cut short because the truth got too complicated? Joy didn't respond. Sonny adjusted her mic but said nothing. Denzel looked toward the audience now. Not the camera, not the hosts, but the faces behind the lights. I'm not here for applause. I've had enough of that to last 3 lifetimes. I came here to say something you don't need a script to feel. Whoopi sat back. And what's that? That truth doesn't need to shout, Denzel said. It just needs to stand still long enough to be seen. The audience still didn't clap, but they listened, hard, because they could feel it now. The quiet wasn't empty, it was loaded, like the kind of silence that comes just before something breaks, or something begins. For a moment, no one moved. The room wasn't frozen, it was bracing. Sonny finally leaned in, trying to shift the energy. You're saying people don't want the truth. I'm saying they've been trained not to recognize it, Denzel replied. Because truth isn't shiny, it's not convenient, and it doesn't come with applause signs. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, sometimes truth just sits there and makes everyone uncomfortable. The camera operator adjusted their angle, instinctively trying to find a wider shot. It was a subtle trick. When tension rises, you cut to the group, not the individual. But Denzel didn't need close-ups to hold the frame. He was still, centered. And in that stillness, the studio felt suddenly too warm. Alyssa shifted in her chair. Okay, but if we're being honest, people are exhausted. With headlines, with outrage, with being made to feel like everything's on fire all the time. Denzel turned to her. You know what's exhausting? His tone hadn't changed, but the weight of it had. Watching the same stories play out, decade after decade. Same pain, different hashtags, and then being told to move on before dessert. Joy exhaled sharply through her nose. Well, that's a bit dramatic, don't you think? No, Denzel said, eyes locking onto her. I think it's familiar, and that's the real problem. Then, without shifting posture, without raising his voice, he spoke the words that cracked the first layer of the room. 2 years ago, a 12-year-old boy was shot 2 blocks from my mother's church. No name in the headline, no interview with the family, just a note about the hoodie he wore, like that explained something. The silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was stunned. I called the newsroom, he continued, asked why they didn't cover it more than a segment. The woman on the line said, and I quote, it didn't test well in pre-rolls. Sonny's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Denzel's voice dropped even quieter. They didn't even test his name. A murmur rose from the back rows. A few gasps. Someone whispered, Jesus, under their breath. Whoopi finally spoke again, this time more direct. We can't control what stories go viral, Denzel. I'm not asking you to, he replied calmly. I'm asking why you give more airtime to stories that sell than stories that scar. That one landed hard, like a gut punch in slow motion. He wasn't attacking, he was testifying. You all spent 15 minutes last week dissecting a congressman's haircut, he added, but when a child was beaten unconscious outside a school in St. Louis, you gave it 9 seconds, right before a cookware ad. Joy looked down at her notepad. Alyssa stopped scribbling. Sonny folded her hands. And Whoopi, she sat very still. This isn't about left or right, Denzel said. It's about how often pain gets edited for timing. The audience wasn't clapping, but they weren't breathing either. And then, just when it seemed the tension might ease, he leaned in and said it, slowly, carefully, like a surgeon making an incision. "You can't talk about unity," he said, "while you're still deciding which truths are worth your airtime. No anger, no drama, just impact." And that's when the cameras caught it. One of the hosts, not Joy, not Sunny, quietly reached for her coffee, but her hand was shaking, not from fear, from recognition. Whoopi leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice tighter than before. "Look, Mr. Washington, we've had activists, lawmakers, journalists, people from every background sit here and speak their truth. This show has always been about creating space for that." Denzel didn't flinch. "Space isn't the same as respect," he said. "A platform without listening is just set design." Alyssa chimed in, her tone defensive but composed. "But you have to admit, this show reaches millions. We try to meet people where they are. That takes compromise." Denzel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I didn't come here to be compromised." He looked at Whoopi directly now, unblinking. "And I didn't come here to be decorative." You could feel it, the crack in the rhythm, the sound of scripted conversation beginning to collapse under the weight of something unscripted. Joy interjected, trying to reset the tone. "Well, if we're being honest, this feels a little confrontational. We invited you here for a discussion." Denzel's expression didn't change. "Then let's have one," he said. "But if you only want words that sit nicely between commercial breaks, say that." A small wave of laughter rippled through the audience, unsure if they were allowed to laugh or if they should be worried about where this was going. Whoopi adjusted her seat, her voice sharpened. "This is a talk show, Mr. Washington. There's a format. We're not trying to censor you, but we are trying to keep the conversation productive." Denzel paused, and then with perfect control, answered with a line that wouldn't just break the room, it would break the internet. "I've done over 50 films," he said. "I know performance when I see it." There it was. The sound wasn't loud, it was a quiet intake of breath, the kind people make when something lands harder than they expected. And then he added, slower this time, "This isn't an interview, it's a costume party, and I left my mask at home." The words hung there. No one moved. Even the camera dolly operator stopped mid-sweep. Whoopi narrowed her eyes, jaw clenched, but said nothing. Behind the scenes, a producer's voice crackled nervously through someone's earpiece. "Do we cut?" Nobody answered, because no one was in control anymore. Not the hosts, not the control room, not even the format. The show had stopped following its usual script. It wasn't flowing. It was unraveling. And Denzel Washington wasn't performing. He was revealing. He leaned back in his chair, not smug, not victorious, just steady, like a man who hadn't come to win a debate, but to refuse pretending anymore. There was no applause, no commercial bumper, just the soft hum of stage lights above, and a silence that was beginning to feel historic. And for the first time in the show's history, it wasn't the host who decided when it was time for a break. It was the silence. Whoopi stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically. She just stood. But the way she did it, slow, tight-lipped, with her hands planted flat on the table, was louder than any outburst. The audience gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "Is this part of the show?" It wasn't. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't even look at Denzel. She looked past him, toward the stage manager, her voice clipped and flat. "We're going to break." The control booth scrambled. One producer mouthed, "Cut to black?" Another shook their head, uncertain. The floor director hesitated. Too long. Because by then the cameras were still rolling, and someone in the audience had their phone out. A live stream had already begun. Denzel stayed seated, hands folded, one leg crossed over the other, unbothered, unmoved. Joy glanced around the table, clearly unsettled. Alyssa looked frozen, Sunny's expression, somewhere between admiration and disbelief. The studio lights hadn't changed, but the room felt darker somehow, warmer, like it was suddenly too small for what was happening inside it. No music played, no commercial rolled, just the sound of Whoopi's heels clicking as she stepped off stage, leaving her mic pack still clipped to her jacket. As she passed the curtain, she muttered under her breath, barely audible, "He came here to burn the whole thing down." Denzel didn't respond. He didn't move. After a few long seconds, a young producer approached him quietly from the side. "Mr. Washington, would you like some water?" Denzel looked up, expression unreadable. "We've taken enough breaks from the truth already," he said. The line wasn't delivered for drama. It wasn't loud, but it was final. That was when the room realized something deeper. This wasn't just a guest going off script. This was a refusal to play a script at all. People in the audience weren't sure if they should clap. Some did. Most just stared. One woman, mid-30s, whispered to her friend beside her, "This doesn't feel like TV anymore. This feels like something else." Backstage, Whoopi was pacing, furious. A producer with a clipboard tried to keep up. "You want us to reset the segment? We can reintroduce?" "No." Whoopi snapped. "He hijacked it. I'm not sitting back down until someone reminds him this isn't his pulpit." "He hasn't raised his voice once," the assistant replied carefully. "And people are listening." "Exactly," Whoopi growled. "They're listening to him, not us." Back on stage, Denzel remained quiet. The host sat awkwardly. Joy reached for her coffee, but didn't sip. Alyssa bit her lip. Sunny just stared. Finally, one of the studio cameras zoomed in slowly, not ordered, not directed, just instinct. And in that moment, it captured something no script could replicate. A man sitting in the middle of silence, refusing to be small for the comfort of the room. It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. And clarity has a way of making everyone else question who they've been pretending to be. Still no cue for commercial, no countdown, just the show unraveling in real time, and Denzel Washington unmoved, holding court without saying a word. At 10:03 a.m., the broadcast finally cut. But by then, it didn't matter. The clip had already gone viral twice. First, the official studio feed, which showed the exact moment Whoopi walked off. Then, a raw phone recording from row C, which captured what happened after. Denzel, sitting alone, the camera lingering, the audience breathless. Backstage, the mood was panic-laced with denial. No one knew who had made the call to delay the commercial cut. No one wanted to admit they'd frozen. In one corner, a producer was whispering into a headset, "We lost the room. We lost the goddamn room." Whoopi's dressing room door was closed. Someone had left a cup of untouched tea outside. Inside, she was pacing, arms folded, staring at a muted monitor playing the live feed on loop. Denzel, still seated, still silent. She knew exactly what she was doing. Whoopi muttered, "He came here to start a fire." "Maybe," her assistant said quietly. But he didn't bring a match. The room was already dry. Across the building, in a small unmarked conference room, ABC executives were already in crisis mode. A lawyer, 2 PR leads, a senior talent coordinator, and the head of broadcast compliance were seated around a table littered with printed transcripts, stills, early headlines, and phones buzzing non-stop. "Damage control. Now," someone said. "Do we spin this as a miscommunication? A misfire? What?" A younger voice at the end of the table spoke up, tentative. "What if we don't spin it? What if we just acknowledge it?" Heads turned. "You want us to validate him?" A VP snapped. "He embarrassed our flagship host on national television. He told the truth," the junior exec replied. "And people heard it. You can't edit that back into safety." Outside the building, the sidewalk was already crowded. A few reporters, a swarm of phones, some fans, some critics. A street preacher holding a sign that read, "Truth ain't pretty, but it walks alone." Meanwhile, Denzel was already gone. He hadn't spoken another word after the break, hadn't looked at the cameras, just calmly stood, picked up his leather notebook, nodded to the crew, and walked out the same way he came in, without noise, without entourage, without apology. He didn't give interviews, didn't call his publicist, didn't tweet. Instead, he went home. That night, he had dinner with his wife. No press, no cameras, no replay of the episode on in the background. Just 2 people in a quiet kitchen, plates half full, jazz playing low. Pauletta looked at him across the table. "You didn't raise your voice." "I didn't need to," he said. She nodded. Still, that room, that moment, it felt like something cracked. Denzel wiped his mouth with a napkin, leaned back in his chair. It did. Then he reached for his old notebook, the same one he carried on set, and flipped it closed. The spine creaked softly. "They thought I came to disrupt," he said. "But I didn't. I came to hold a mirror." And across the country, millions were staring into it. On TikTok, a 17-second clip of Denzel saying space isn't the same as respect had already hit 4.2 million views. On Twitter, the trending tag wasn't just about the show. It was personal. Denzel didn't flinch. One post read, "He didn't yell. He didn't blame. He just made the truth sound louder than the stage." At ABC headquarters, the executive team drafted a vague, cautious statement. Today's episode included a spirited conversation about national dialogue and media responsibility. We remain committed to diverse perspectives and respectful discourse. It hit the internet like wet paper. One journalist reposted it with the caption, "Translation, we didn't expect him to show up unfiltered." By midnight, commentary had gone global. In London, a morning anchor called it the most honest 5 minutes daytime television has ever accidentally aired. In South Africa, a poet tweeted, What Denzel said wasn't loud, but it didn't blink. That's why it stayed. And still, no response from Denzel. Just silence, but not the kind that hides, the kind that follows you into uncomfortable rooms and asks, softly, "So now that you've heard it, what are you going to do?" 3 days passed. No interviews, no clarifications, no PR push, just silence. Until one quiet afternoon, without warning, a simple live stream appeared on Denzel Washington's official page. No graphics, no intro music, no camera crew, just a single shot. Denzel seated at a plain desk in a dim, sunlit room. No suit this time. A soft charcoal sweater, that same worn leather notebook resting beside his right hand. Behind him, a wall the color of ash. He looked into the lens, not down, not away, straight ahead. No script, no teleprompter. "You've all been asking for a response," he said calmly. "So here it is, and I'll only say it once." He took a breath, not the kind you take before performing, the kind you take before releasing something you've carried too long. "I didn't go on that show to cause a moment. I went because I realized I've been quiet in rooms that were too loud with the wrong things." He didn't name Whoopi, didn't mention The View. He didn't have to. "I've spent my life learning when to speak and when to stay still. And there's value in silence. But silence isn't always neutral. Sometimes it's consent dressed up as grace." He leaned back, resting his palms flat on the desk. "I watched the media shift over the years, from reflection to reaction. I saw how truth got replaced by timing, how stories that don't scream loud enough get pushed to the edge of the screen." He looked down just once at his notebook, then back at the camera. "What happened on that stage wasn't about me, and it wasn't about a host walking off. It was about a rhythm that's been playing too long, one where only certain voices get to sound calm, collected, reasonable, while others are labeled difficult just for not shrinking." The live stream chat was exploding. Hearts, comments, fire emojis, all flying past. But Denzel never looked at the screen. He wasn't here for reaction. He was here for release. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I just stopped pretending the script was honest." He paused. "Let the words land without decoration. We say we want uncomfortable conversations until the discomfort arrives. Then we reach for format, for edits, for exit signs. And then he said it. The line that would be stitched into murals, screen printed onto t-shirts, quoted from pulpits and classrooms. "I didn't destroy a show. I broke a rhythm, one that forgot its own lyrics." He closed the notebook slowly, carefully, like it was something sacred. The camera stayed on him a few seconds longer as he sat back, one hand still resting on the cover. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm just awake, and I won't go back to sleep to make anyone else comfortable." Then he ended the stream. No call to action, no like and share, just off. But the world didn't turn off with him. The clip spread instantly, cut, looped, translated. The line, "I broke a rhythm," appeared in protest signs, classroom slideshows, late-night monologues. Teachers assigned it in writing prompts. Pastors quoted it from the pulpit. Teenagers whispered it to each other in crowded hallways where they'd spent years being told to sit down and blend in. Back at The View, producers were meeting behind closed doors. Ratings had hit a 2-year high, but none of them were celebrating. One of the showrunners admitted quietly, "We didn't lose control. We never had it. We just thought we did." Joy returned. Sunny stayed quiet. Alyssa tried to carry the middle. But Whoopi, she didn't show up the rest of the week. No statement, no exit, just absence. And in that silence, people realized the stage didn't collapse. It got exposed, because it was never about shouting, or spectacle, or scandal. It was about someone finally walking in and refusing to play along, refusing to shrink to fit the seat. And in doing so, he gave everyone watching permission to do the same. Not with noise, not with anger, just with truth, unfiltered, unapologetic, and steady enough to shake the room.